The alert had no sound, no light, no vibration. But it changed everything the moment it woke deep under the concrete bones of a forgotten university lab in New Mexico, where fluorescent lights still flickered overhead as if clinging to relevance. A pressure-sealed crate that hadn't been touched in 6 decades hissed open with the slow defiance of time itself. Alara Vance hadn't meant to find anything that mattered. Not on her first week, not in this forgotten wing of the physics department. They used as an unofficial archive/storage dump, where half the boxes were still labeled Cold War detritus, and the other half just had red tape. Across them like that meant someone somewhere would eventually come back to deal with. And she was 27, 2 months out of her doctorate from Caltech. Clever, but not arrogant. Introverted, but obsessive in the way only a postdoc on her 3rd cup of coffee and no sleep can be. And she had the quiet kind of brilliance that made faculty remember her name even if she rarely raised her voice during seminars. She wasn't looking for secrets, only for spare components to cannibalize for her gravitational noise reduction array project. But when she tripped on the latch of the half-collapsed shelf and sent a rust-streaked metal box clattering open, what spilled out didn't belong in any physics lab she'd ever seen. It was a cylinder, maybe 1.5 feet long, about the size of a thermos, wrapped in some kind of blackened alloy composite that shimmered slightly even in low light, with a pattern of glyphs etched so finely it looked like circuitry, but felt more like language. She froze with it in her hands, unsure whether to laugh or call security, because the part of her brain that still believed in reason said this was probably some kind of experimental casing from the 60s or 70s, while the part of her that read too many science fiction novels whispered that the thing was humming, ever so faintly, and the hum was modulating with her touch. Professor Henders, she called, keeping her voice flat, professional, pretending her pulse wasn't jumping as the glyphs flared. Just once, a shimmer like heat through oil, and then settled back to inert metal. Professor Nolan Henders, head of Applied Quantum Systems, was an aging warhorse of academic life, the kind of man whose ideas were 5 years ahead of the field, but whose lab always looked like it ran on chewing gum and grant rejections. And he appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later with a coffee mug in one hand and a folder in the other, blinking at her like a dad pulled out of a nap. "Alara, please tell me you didn't open anything that says classified on it." "There's no label," she said, holding the artifact carefully, like it might break or scream or both. There was a file wedged under it, Lambda 6 something. "Can't tell. Ink's all water damaged." Anders set down the mug and came closer. His brow furrowed, then stopped cold when he saw the cylinder. His voice dropped low. "No longer sleepy. I've seen that symbol before in a DoD report from 1983, never released publicly. They thought it was a failed communication interface, built during the early SETI programs, something we were supposedly trying to reverse engineer from intercepted pulses near Proxima Centauri. That got buried when funding collapsed. Why was it stored in a university basement?" Alara asked, frowning as she turned the artifact slowly in her hands. Henders didn't answer at first, his fingers tightening around the edges of the folder, as if bracing for some old memory to surface. "Alara, listen to me carefully now. Do not plug that into anything. Do not power it. Do not expose it to infrared or microwave radiation. Hell, don't even breathe too hard near it. I don't know what that thing is exactly, but I know people went missing over it. And I know one of the few documents I saw mentioned something called a dead man relay. But the problem was Alara had already run a passive scan when she pulled it out. The lab security sensors automatically pinged everything for radiation and mass density. And that ping, quiet and harmless as it seemed, had been enough across the solar system, beyond Mars, far past the edge of Earth's sparse defense network. A pulse that had not been heard in 1,000 years echoed through a narrow slit of folded quantum space, like a breath drawn through clenched teeth, and a listening device the size of a small moon, turned one eye toward Earth. Flickering with ancient permissions, written in code no human had ever seen back in the lab. Elara held the artifact a little tighter, not because she feared it, but because she couldn't shake the feeling that it had changed her. That something about it was now listening to her in return. She didn't know that in 14 hours the first Centauri dreadnought would exit faster than light translation just outside Saturn's orbit. She didn't know that by touching it, she had reactivated a beacon that the Galactic Empire had once feared so deeply. They had glassed entire star systems to ensure it never broadcast again. She didn't know that she had, with the curiosity of a scientist and the innocence of a human, just declared war on a civilization older than Earth's continents. All she knew was that something about the glyphs didn't feel random. They felt aligned, and in the hum at the edge of her perception, she thought she heard music that had no origin, only destination. The signal didn't travel through radio, or pulse along the electromagnetic spectrum, or ride gravity waves like the few classified FTL experiments humans had dared to simulate deep beneath Antarctica. It existed in a smaller slice of reality, a dimension folded so tightly against itself that even the most sensitive quantum sensors ever built by humanity could only speculate about its presence. The pulse initiated from the artifact was simple in its structure, composed of 7 data harmonics overlaid with a compressed symmetry key. And yet that simplicity was what made it terrifying to those who understood what it meant, for it wasn't a message meant to be read or translated or decoded. It was a command, one burned into the logic trees of ancient war networks that had not been awakened in 1,000 Earth years. It had been designed by a species long since extinguished, not by weakness, but by a fear of what they might become if they ever allowed themselves to escalate without limit. And now, buried beneath miles of military-grade firewalls and decaying eye relay stations orbiting the black dwarf designated Corellan 6, the Centauri Command Beacon Prime registered the ancient sequence and unlocked its response with cold, immediate precision. The code was accepted as authentic. The sender was identified as hostile. Unknown derivative origin. The last command. Contingency. Protocol Omega Red. Total mobilization authority. And so, as silently as a ghost passing through a tomb, Fleet Group Seraph 9, hidden for centuries in the upper layers of a nebula cloaked by dark matter fluctuations, came online. 12 dreadnought-class carriers, each the size of Manhattan and equipped with matter fission drives that could collapse planetary crusts within hours, began the slow unfurling of their systems. Their lead vessel, the Vengeance of Korath, registered the trajectory of the beacon's origin, plotted it with margin of error precision, and initiated translation countdown. Estimated arrival 14.3 Earth hours. And in that moment, a decision made by one human scientist in a dusty university storage room became the central strategic concern of the most feared empire in the known galaxy. Back on Earth, unaware of what she had truly awakened, Dr. Elara Vance sat in the low hum of the physics lab's back chamber, now bathed in low red light from the facility's standby mode, her laptop screen flickering with data. She couldn't quite explain. The artifact had stopped humming audibly, but when she held it, she felt warmth in the metal, localized, deliberate, almost like it responded to her presence. Her fingers hovered over the keys as she tried to log the spectral emissions again. But this time, something was wrong. The sensors weren't just overloaded. They were interfered with, as if an external field was rejecting the very act of measurement. She glanced toward Professor Henders, who had abandoned any pretense of calm. His face pale, his hand gripping the armrest of the stool he hadn't sat down on since the crate opened. Elara, shut everything down. Disconnect from the campus network. Now. What? Why? She asked, half turning, but not yet moving. Because if what I'm afraid of is true, he said, voice raw, and this thing didn't just wake up, it called. Something. And we don't have time to argue about how or why. We need to assume the worst. She hesitated, part of her scientific mind still rebelling against the leap in logic, still looking for a rational grounding, still not fully ready to accept the weight of what they had touched. Then the lab light surged and went black. Emergency backup flickering. On with a hollow click, and the intercom buzzed with a tone neither of them had ever heard. The university security channel, scrambled and automated, spoke in a clipped voice. Attention. High-altitude anomaly detected. National Defense Protocol 2 to 17 active. Remain indoors. This is not a drill. Henders's eyes widened. No. Early. It wasn't supposed to happen this fast. Alara's breath caught. Who's early? He didn't answer. Thousands of miles away. The Strategic Aerospace Defense Network lit up like a Christmas tree. Norda scrambled intercept protocols. But the anomaly wasn't atmospheric, and it wasn't inbound on any known path. Something had appeared. Just appeared between Saturn and Jupiter. A dense object cluster that hadn't been tracked inbound and hadn't existed in their sky 2 minutes earlier. There were no heat signatures, no drive trails, no propulsion readings, just mass, cold and alien and fast, shifting trajectories with a grace that no known physics allowed. They were coming, and they weren't responding to hails in the skies. Above Earth, low-orbit telescopes picked up flashes of formation movement. Perfectly spaced, symmetrical, intelligent. Dozens of defense satellites scrambled to repoint and scan, but one by one, their feeds glitched. Static filling the frames as if something was eating the data before it reached the ground. And in the middle of it all, Alara Vance sat in a small, silent lab with a piece of technology no human had ever built. And yet something inside her refused to feel afraid, not because she didn't understand the danger, but because somewhere, deep inside, the artifact had shown her something she couldn't explain. Like an image she never saw with her eyes, but now lived behind them. It wasn't a weapon, it was a memory, encoded in rules, sent once by hands that no longer existed to be warning, and she had tripped its failsafe. Dr. Vance, a new voice said, and she looked up, startled to find Colonel Meredith Kane, military liaison for Homeland Astrophysical Threat Analysis, standing in the lab entrance. With 4 armed escorts, we're taking the object. You coming with us. Effective immediately, you are now part of Homeland Task Force Eclipse. Alara blinked, then slowly stood, still holding the artifact, still unsure if letting go of it would end something, or start it. What is it? She asked. Kane didn't answer. Directly, only stepped forward and held out a secure containment unit marked with triple-sealed radiation shielding. We don't know. But someone just answered it. The moment the containment unit sealed around the artifact, the hum stopped, not faded or weakened, but stopped entirely, like a door slamming shut on something ancient that had only just started to breathe again. Dr. Alara Vance sat in the rear of the black military convoy truck, knees pulled in, eyes darting between the 2 armed guards opposite her, trying to process the velocity with which her quiet postdoctoral week had turned into a federal mobilization. Under armed escort, as if the universe had been waiting for someone exactly like her to make exactly the wrong discovery. Colonel Meredith Kane sat across from her, silent and unreadable, dressed in a dark uniform, devoid of insignia save for the Eclipse Task Force emblem, an eclipse star wrapped in orbit lines, her expression one of stone. The kind of expression honed over decades of handling truths that could never be spoken on public channels. The road beneath them trembled faintly as a deep subsonic rumble passed overhead. One Alara barely registered but instinctively understood. Wasn't from the Earth. There were no engines that made that kind of sound. Not in their world. She finally spoke, her voice tight with disbelief. Colonel, I need you to explain to me what that sound was. What's happening above us? Kane gave a slow nod, her jaw tightening. 17 minutes ago, 12 objects of unknown origin, translated into real space from what we can only classify as non-local vectors, just beyond Saturn. No known FTL method matches the signature. Number: gravitational displacement, no thermal bloom. They just arrived. That's impossible, Alara whispered, voice dry, mind clinging to laws she once believed were absolute. Tell them then, Kane replied flatly, tapping the case with the artifact resting between them. You activated a quantum phase signal embedded in this object, something we've been monitoring for decades but never could replicate or translate. Our best assumption was it was inert, a Cold War relic tied to early SETI Black Ops. Until today, I didn't mean to activate it, Alara said, trying to defend herself, not from legal blame, but from the awful reality that something irreversible had just happened because she opened a box. We know, Kane said, and her tone wasn't unkind, but it wasn't gentle either. We have analysis teams pulling everything from the residual data bursts, and the early models suggest you didn't send a signal. You responded to one. That thing had been listening, waiting for the right harmonic field. You gave it power, it gave a reply, and someone out there took it as confirmation that Earth is holding a weapon we shouldn't have. Outside the convoy, fighter jets streaked overhead in formation, barely visible behind the thin evening clouds, while civilian news channels speculated on atmospheric anomalies and solar irregularities. As per emergency information suppression protocol, what the public didn't know, what even most world governments didn't yet know, was that Earth was no longer a bystander in a cold and vast universe. They had been noticed in orbit around Saturn. The vengeance of Korath extended its long-range data arrays, mapping every planetary body in the solar system, analyzing civilization-level emissions and calculating optimal strike patterns to prevent interstellar contamination. Admiral Narek Sithkar, commander of Fleet Group Seraph 9, stood before the central tactical display of the bridge, his crimson armor glinting beneath the soft indigo glow of stellar maps. His eyes narrowed as he watched the blue planet's energy reading spike and adapt with shocking speed. No response to 3 direct neural hails. His communications officer reported, no protocol flags, no decryption attempt. Either they are ignoring us, or they are entirely incapable of understanding us. Then they are unfit, Sithkar said with grim certainty. In the name of the Remnant Compact, and under Article 47 of the Survival Doctrine, we move to sterilize the origin world before the signal replicates. But Admiral, another officer began, hesitating. They show high structural adaptation, multi-domain defense organization, and network-wide analysis capability. There are signs of emergent tactical cognition, which makes them even more dangerous. Sithkar replied, voice sharp. If primitives can harness a dead empire's technology by accident, imagine what they could do if they learn to wield it with intent. We eliminate them now, before their chaos becomes weaponized reason. And with that, the command was given. The first weapon platform on the Vengeance activated. A segmented obelisk-like structure lying toward Earth, calculating gravity anchors. To fire an ether lance of its directed energy weapon designed not to destroy cities, but to rupture the magnetosphere, frying all electrical infrastructure and forcing planetary collapse without immediate mass extinction. It would be a warning and a message back on Earth. As the convoy reached the secure research base known as Site Sigma, deep in the Nevada desert, Alara stepped out under a crimson-orange sky and looked up to see strange contrails. Tearing through the cloud line, Colonel Kane's secure satellite phone rang. And when she answered it, her face changed. Alara, she said slowly, deliberately, walking up to her as personnel swarmed around the facility. I don't have time to explain everything, but you need to come with me, now an orbital weapon. Just targeted our upper atmosphere, and our systems showed something intercepted it. Intercepted it? Alara echoed, Stun Kane didn't stop walking. Yes, we didn't fire anything. No satellite platform responded. Something else blocked the shot. Alara's heart raced. Her breath caught in her throat. Something else. Something that had been listening. When she touched the artifact, something that had answered, she didn't know if that meant they had an ally or something worse than the Zentarian far above them. Hidden in polar orbit, a small device no larger than a briefcase blinked for the first time in over 1,000 years, its surface unfolding silently, casting out a prism of data waves into the void. Second signal had been sent, but this one wasn't. A beacon. It was a summons. The summoned presence hadn't spoken yet, not in a voice anyone could hear, but its existence was enough to change the calculus. The failed attack had left a scar in the upper atmosphere. A thin radiation seam slicing across the magnetosphere like a cauterized wound, visible only to the eyes of satellites and the sensitive sensors in the orbital defense ring. But it hadn't completed the rupture. That meant the weapon had been blocked mid-firing. No natural interference, no Earthborne defense system, and no malfunction. Something intervened, and it happened just 36 minutes after Alara. Vance had made first contact with the artifact Asterisk inside Site Sigma, a high-security underground research facility encased in kilometer-thick basalt and tungsten-laced alloys. She now stood inside Command Briefing Room 4, a space made of glasscrete and cold logic, where defense chiefs, quantum intelligence, architects, and astrophysics advisors had been called from across the country. Elara, dressed now in standard black ops-issue facility clothing, stood at the front of the room with her hands slightly trembling as she watched a real-time display of orbital objects slowly revolving across a holographic rendering of Earth's gravity well foreign vessels, all labeled hostile, unidentified, hung just beyond the moon's orbital edge, maintaining non-geosynchronous drift. Silent, observing, waiting around the room. Names she only knew from textbooks were watching her instead. General O'Neill, Director of North American Strategic Defense DR. Nia Harcourt, Head of Quantum Surveillance Division. Chief Marshal Alan Reyes of USSF Earth Orbit Operations. And, of course, Colonel Kane, standing at the corner with her arms crossed and jaw locked. It was Dr. Harcourt who finally broke the silence. Her voice low but razor-edged with tension. You initiated the broadcast sequence unknowingly, Dr. Vance. But that signal had triggered something that had enough cultural and military weight to summon a reaction from what we believe is an ancient, dormant fleet. We don't know if you woke a trap or lit a beacon. What we do know is that they responded with hostility. And something else. Stepped in. Alara inhaled deeply. I think the artifact responded again. It sensed the attack. Not like a weapon, but more like a failsafe. Maybe a Guardian protocol. You're saying it defended us, General O'Neill said skeptically, leaning forward, eyes sharp under gray brows. I'm saying it didn't allow the strike to complete, Alara clarified. And we need to assume it wasn't random. Let's not jump to conclusions. Reyes cut in, frustrated. They haven't opened comms. They haven't sent a message. Maybe they're waiting for a full strategic collapse. For all we know, this is stage 1 of a planetary suppression sequence. They could glass the crust from orbit before we get off a second warning shot. No, Alara said, turning to the center display, stepping toward the artifact's decryption stream. They're not acting like suppressors. They're acting like someone who found a trigger they thought they buried centuries ago. This, she pointed at the artifact, its dormant casing pulsing faintly in red. This isn't ours. But it's also not alien in the conventional sense. It's a remnant, a record, something built to carry a warning forward. Not to conquer, not to destroy, but to inform. Colonel Kane stepped forward now, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. We decrypted partial data from the second pulse. It's written in an unknown structured language, nested within a logic tree. but there's syntax. And we think there's embedded audio inside the waveform of voice. It's fragmented, distorted, but it speaks. Kane tapped her tablet, and a low metallic modulation filled the room, rising into a distorted vocal pattern that was unmistakably artificial, and yet not synthetic in the way humans designed a memory preserved. Containment failed. Initiate context merge. Entity, origin unknown. Language mapped to host. Commence interaction request. Silence followed. The room shifted. It was Reyes who broke the quiet tone flat. So the war signal wasn't a war declaration. It was a context call, a handshake protocol. And they answered it with a fleet of dreadnoughts? Ilara's hands were cold now, her mind locking in the horrifying contradiction. They didn't understand. They didn't read the message. They assumed a threat. And they're preparing to erase us. Over a misunderstanding. For the first time, General O'Neill looked unsure. How do we respond to something like that? Diplomacy isn't effective against a species that interprets curiosity as aggression. We don't argue. Ilara said quietly, we speak their language. I know how to write into the artifact now. I've been studying the waveform. Give me 4 hours and I can build a counter sequence. Something respectful, something they'll recognize as cultural protocol, not technological mimicry. That's a hell of a risk, Kane said, stepping forward. They could interpret it as escalation. They already did, Ilara replied. Voice steady now. So let's show them who we are. 4 hours later, Earth's first interstellar diplomatic message, not born from government councils or centuries of planning, but from the mind of a single scientist, was encoded into the artifact's interface through a repurposed neutrino emitter stationed on a mountain. A ray outside Los Alamos. Ilara spoke the words into the modulator herself. The message carried, not just as sound, but as a translation scaffold embedded in signal logic designed to reflect intention, not just vocabulary. We did not build you. We found you. We are not those who came before, but we are here, now, willing to understand. If war is your memory, let us offer a new one. If fear is your trigger, let us be your proof that not all contact ends in violence. The signal was launched into orbit at 11:03 p.m. UTC 3 minutes later. The Centauri fleet acknowledged its first signal in 6 seconds after that. Something else responded to a third pulse from a third presence coming from somewhere much closer than anyone expected, from Earth's own moon, where nothing human was supposed to be, but something had been waiting there watching for a very long time. The moon, long, assumed barren of life, thought, or threat, had always been humanity's silent partner, its first tether to the stars, its first mirror in the sky. But now it spoke back, not with dust or light, but with intention, embedded in an energy form no sensor had seen before and no human had. Language to describe it came as a wave-sharp, clean, and non-destructive, but absolute in its purpose, as the Centauri vengeance of Korath prepared a second ether lance. This one, calibrated for precision tectonic disruption, centered on Earth's Pacific ridge. The pulse from the moon struck its energy lattice and folded it in on itself, a maneuver so sudden and exact that it shattered the lance emitter without triggering detonation, dispersing the magnetic scaffolding like paper set ablaze in zero-gone Earth. The impact was measured first as a data glitch, then an impossible physics event in orbit. High-speed intercept feeds from America's military satellites played the moment. Back at 1/16th speed, a blast from the lunar surface, not made of matter, but of modulated quantum pressure like a statement etched in energy at Site Sigma. Colonel Kane stood frozen over the live feed, arms tense at her side. They were going to destroy the Pacific fault line, she said, voice low and mechanical, like she didn't want to say it out loud. They would have fractured the planet in 5, maybe 6 years subsurface collapse. Starting from seismic instability, And we're still calling this a misunderstanding. Reyes snapped, his voice sharp and echoing off the concrete walls. They were aiming to kill the planet, not the species. That's extermination protocol. No, Alara said, still staring at the data stream as she reran the lunar pulse analysis. Not extermination. Prevention. They think we're a contamination risk. They saw the artifact activate, and they assumed we were the inheritors of whatever race built it, the ones they once fought. They're not acting out of vengeance. They're acting out of fear. General O'Neill's jaw locked, and he looked toward the comms technician behind the control glass. Do we have confirmation on the lunar source? Yes, sir, the young technician called back, pale but steady. It's not a human signal. No footprint. No energy signature like ours. But it's deliberate, encoded. Looks like some kind of autonomous defense node that's been dormant for centuries. Another remnant, Alara whispered, a chill crawling down her spine. The artifact wasn't just a memory vault. It was a key. And now that we've turned it, everything tied to it is waking up. The room was silent again, until Colonel Kane spoke. We just intercepted a new signal, this time from the Zentari themselves. It's not an attack order. It's a data stream. They're responding to our diplomatic sequence. Reyes stepped forward. What does it say? Kane's face was tight as she read the translation scrolling across her tablet. Your signal has been acknowledged. You are not the creators. You are not the threat. But your hands hold. Dangerous echoes. Surrender the artifact. Decommission the defense node. Stand down all orbital emissions. Failure will be seen as consent to conflict. Stand down? General O'Neill echoed, incredulous. After they tried to crack the planet in half, now they want us to turn off our defenses and just hand over the one thing that protected us? Ilara's voice cut through the noise. It's a test. Not of strength, of intent. They don't trust what we are, because they don't understand it. And I don't think they can understand it. They're ancient, efficient, calculating, but we're not. We're messy, adaptable, intuitive. That scares them. Dr. Harcourt nodded. Thoughtful asterisk. They're used to empires, to species that climb toward godhood or implode under their own weight. They've probably only known civilizations that rise in fire or fall in ash. We're somewhere in between. A wild card. General O'Neill turned to the room. So what do we do? Do we give them what they want? No, Alara said, turning slowly, her voice calm but resolute. We don't surrender. But we don't escalate either. Reyes raised an eyebrow. And what exactly does that leave? A response, she said. Not from the government, not from the military, from the people, from the species. They don't understand humans because they haven't heard us, not the real us, not what we build, what we dream, what we value. They see threats. We have to show them meaning. Colonel Kane stepped forward, slowly. You want to respond to a galactic empire with a, what? Cultural exhibition? No, Alara replied, with a truth pulse. We send them a story, our story. Not through words, but through sequence, through rhythm, through pattern and probability. The artifact carries a neural pattern scaffold. I can use it to encode human experience, not just information, but interpretation. You want to teach them humanity, Kane said. Finally grasping the scale, Alara nodded. Yes, one transmission, not propaganda, not deception, just clarity. Let them see us, not through telescopes or battle patterns, but through us after a moment of silence. General O'Neill gave a slow, tired nod. You've got 1 hour, one shot. Whatever you're going to show them, make it count. Alara walked out of the chamber toward the signal room, heart racing. Artifact cradled in her arms like a sleeping relic of a civilization that had left a gift too powerful for its own time. Now it was hers, now it was ours, and far above. The 12 Centauri ships held position in disciplined formation, silent, awaiting the human response, not knowing that in the ruins of forgotten war, a new kind of warfare was being prepared. War of meaning, a war of memory, and in that war, humanity might just be the first species ever to win by understanding instead of fear. They had no warships, no interstellar artillery, no planetary shields or ancient empires at their backs. What they had was a room, a signal, a relic from a war they never fought, and a species' entire shared existence encoded into the hands of a scientist who once thought her career would be spent calibrating gravity sensors and fixing broken lab equipment inside the core signal chamber at Site Sigma. The artifact now sat embedded in a containment cradle of graphene-lined alloy, its surface pulsing with faint blue geometries, responding not to motion or heat but to something deeper intentioned. Alara Vance worked in silence, her eyes locked on the cascading streams of variable logic and neural map overlays projecting from the artifact into the air around her, her fingers flying across the control panels of the translator array. 45 seconds until primary transmission cycle completes. The system AI announced, voice sterile but calm behind the reinforced glass. A full panel of military and scientific personnel watched with hushed tension. But Alara was no longer aware of them. She was inside the moment. She had used the scaffold embedded in the artifact's core, a lattice of logic not built by human hands, but open to interpretation, as if it expected others to come later and leave their mark, and built a cascade of human experience through it. She encoded not history, but meaning, the joy of first flight, the sorrow of Hiroshima, the rise of art, the agony of injustice, the unity after disaster, the defiance after betrayal, the whispers of hope passed from generation to generation in lullabies, protests, novels, radio static, refugee songs, terminal monologues, rescue missions, ruined cities, and rebuilt towers. Alara used music. She used mathematics. She used rhythm. She used the fundamental patterns of logic and chaos that humans danced between without realizing they'd mastered both. And when the transmission hit its peak, the artifact came alive. It rose from the cradle, not by thrust or lift, but by gravitational rejection. A slow, deliberate levitation that seemed to ask for the pulse to be born. Then it fired not outward in a straight beam, but in a spherical wave, wrapping the planet in a blanket of structured energy, compressing the entire signal into a fractal package launched on a neutrino burst so thin it could pass through stars. Every ship in the Centauri fleet received it simultaneously. So did something else on the far side of the moon and far beyond. Satellites that hadn't functioned in centuries blinked awake, their logic strings triggered by a pulse they were genetically coded to remember on board the Vengeance of Korath. Admiral Sithker stood rigid on the command deck, surrounded by tactical officers, frozen in place as their displays were overtaken, not hijacked, not corrupted, but reprogrammed to display something the Centauri had no words for. There was no speech. There was only a stream of memory, an entire species worth of dreams and fractures and complexity poured into a wave of layered mathematics and sensory equivalents so dense it bypassed translation and entered directly into synthetic cognitions as Centauri built to conquer, to analyze, to neutralize stopped moving for the first time in 10,000 cycles. The bridge of a Centauri dreadnought fell into total silence, not from hesitation, but uncertainty. Command systems have not been compromised, said the lead AI tactician on board, but data fidelity suggests high logic structure. Pattern recursion exceeds calculated limits. Cultural depth is anomalous. Sithker's voice was dry. What does it mean? It means, the AI said, they're not the architects of the beacon, but they are not primitives. They have evolved beyond expected timelines. They have repurposed remnants not for dominance, but for comprehension. Sithker turned to his officers, his anger no longer hot, but cold and calculating. If they could do that in 4 planetary revolutions, if they could respond to a class red activation with culture instead of aggression, they are not what we expected. And that was when the second pulse hit them, but this time, it wasn't from Earth, it came from the moon, the defense node dormant. For centuries, now recognized that the signal had achieved its purpose. A species had interpreted memory and responded with meaning. That was the test, and humanity had passed it. The pulse from the moon didn't hit the Centauri ships like a weapon, it hit them like a mirror. It showed them a memory, not Earth's, not the beacons, but their own, an echo of their own past. The war they waged to erase the ones who built the artifact, guilt encoded in their oldest command structures. The fear that one day they'd meet another species who wouldn't just survive them, but understand them. The pulse shut down every weapon system across their entire fleet, not by force, but by logic. The fleet's AI core refused to fire. Sith core stepped forward, voice trembling, not from weakness, but from recognition. They didn't start a war, he said quietly. They ended ours. And back on Earth, Alara Vance finally stepped back from the artifact, her legs weak, her hands burning with the cold of spent energy. She didn't collapse. She stood, because no one else could have done what she just did. She hadn't won a battle, rewritten it not with missiles or counterattacks, but with humanity's most dangerous weapon, understanding across the silence of space. In the place where war was moments from ignition, a breath had been held and was now exhaled. Not in fire, not in conquest, but in the stunned quiet of realization. The Centauri did not surrender. They did something far rarer. They paused inside the command cathedral of the vengeance of Korath. Admiral Sithkar stood motionless, the fractal residuals of the human transmission still dancing in the periphery of his vision, shadows of experiences he could not feel, but now, somehow, recognized with a part of himself he had long since buried beneath code and chain of commands. Fleet remained in position. 12 dreadnoughts, 37 planetary sterilizers, 9 siege vessels, all armed, all at full power, all capable of turning Earth into a molten scar in minutes, and yet none moved, none fired, because now they understood what they hadn't before. Not the artifact, not the technology, not the signal itself, but the species behind it. Humans, chaotic and undisciplined, weren't mimicking the ancient ones. They were resurrecting something the ancients themselves had lost: culture without uniformity, emotion without collapse, creativity without restraint, defiance without nihilism. Core turned slowly toward his second-in-command, Commander Irith, whose face bore the blank neutrality of duty. Yet even that was cracking. This signal, it is not a tactic, Irith said, voice lower than protocol allowed. It is truth rendered as information. It bypassed all defense layers. Even our judgment algorithm stuttered. Sithkar walked toward the viewport, gazing at the distant marble of Earth, still ignorant in its lower atmosphere, still buzzing with radio noise, orbital traffic, and the unfiltered sound of a species too busy surviving to notice they'd stood on the edge of extinction. They showed us no strength, the Admiral said. They showed us themselves. And we were not prepared for the simplicity of that honesty. A silence passed that was heavier than any weapons recoil. Then he turned to his crew. Stand down all primary weapons. Transition fleet to passive mode. Send orders to recall forward. Drones, all siege elements go cold. Effective immediately. Earth is reclassified from pre-collapse threat to observation tier delta. But sir, Irith asked cautiously, what of the artifact? Do we retrieve it? Sithkar's answer came slowly, but without doubt. No. Let it remain with them. It is not a weapon in their hands. It is a mirror. Let them keep it. We will watch from afar. Learn, reassess, and if their chaos consumes them, then it will not be our doing. Sithker said quietly. And if it does not, then we will speak to them again. Not as executioners, but as equals. Back on Earth, at Site Sigma, the control room had become a still frame from a dream no one believed, yet screens flashed with new orbital data. The Centauri fleet was moving, but not toward Earth. They were shifting into high-orbit drift, retracting. Their siege arrays aligning for what the military observers called a translation arca retreat. But not from fear, from reconsideration, Colonel. Kane stood with arms crossed, the glow of the consoles painting her sharp features in pale light, watching as the 12 red markers representing Centauri dreadnoughts rotated into precise FTL trajectories. "They're leaving," she said flatly, not asking, not hoping, but confirming. "Why?" Alara, seated beside her, her face pale and tired, didn't smile. She wasn't triumphant. She was still processing what had happened. "They saw us," she whispered. "Really saw us." And they blinked. General O'Neill's voice came through the intercom from command. "Stand down all national alert levels to ThreatCon yellow. Keep orbitals on passive lock. We're not out of this yet." But they didn't fire. God help us, they didn't fire. In a separate room, UN Security Council representatives were calling for emergency session at NASA, ESA, CNSA, and Roscosmos were scrubbing orbital logs, baffled and confused at what they'd missed. World news had already caught on to the satellite irregularities, but the truth hadn't reached them yet. Only a few people on the planet understood that Earth had stood within moments of being obliterated, not by hatred, but by misunderstood caution, and that it had survived, not because it was strong, but because it had been honest in the hours that followed. The artifact was placed back into containment, no longer a threat, no longer just an object, but now an ambassador of sorts, an emissary of forgotten wars and remembered peace. Alara sat in the base's observation wing, staring up at the night sky through bulletproof glass, her knees drawn up, her body exhausted, her mind racing. Kane approached quietly, standing beside her without speaking for a while, then softly, "You just stopped a war with a poem." Alara gave a tired laugh, her voice raw. "Not a poem. A memory, not just mine." "Ours." Kane nodded. "Still, that's going in every textbook that matters. And probably some that don't." They stood together in silence, watching as the last light of the alien fleet flickered and vanished into the stars. God, not lost. They would be back someday, but maybe not with weapons. Maybe next time they would come to listen, and maybe humanity would be ready to speak again. 2 weeks passed, and Earth rotated like it always had. Wars still raged in forgotten corners. Politics remained tangled in bureaucracies, and most of humanity, as always, continued unaware of how close the stars had come to burning them away. But within classified vaults beneath Psych Sigma, and behind locked doors in diplomatic backchannels between the Pentagon, Geneva, Beijing, and even silent nodes buried beneath the Siberian tundra, the story was known. The Centauri had not invaded, the artifact had not detonated, and Alara Vance had not just made contact. She had set a precedent. A new protocol was created, buried within the Department of Interstellar Contingencies, Project Myr Rar Fiat. Its center was not a weapon, it was a human, and she was exhausted. Ella sat alone in her temporary quarters. Temporary, now going on day 17, staring at the artifact, which lay dormant once more on a reinforced pedestal beside her bed, like some strange pet curled in hibernation. No light, no hum, no pulse, but she could still feel it. It wasn't mechanical awareness. It was something else. Something in her bones. In her dreams, in the sudden flashes of memories she never lived, but somehow remembered, a moon of glass, shattering under pressure, a fleet retreating into starlight. A single phrase burned into alien stone. "We spoke to survive," and in the back of her mind, She began to suspect that she hadn't just used the artifact, she had been changed by it. Permission to enter. Came Kane's voice through the security speaker at the door. Alara pressed the panel without hesitation, and the reinforced door, unsealed with a low hydraulic hiss, Kane stepped in, not in her usual uniform, but dressed down, black shirt, no rank badge, no weapons. Human. Figured you might want to get outside, she said, holding up a secure case. Come walk with me. They emerged into the Nevada dawn, Site Sigma's hidden hangars behind them. The desert wide and empty ahead. The case in Kane's hand held a new device smaller than the artifact, but clearly built around the same principles. The president wants to offer a speech, Kane said as they walked across the dust-cracked basin. A broadcast. Something global. But they don't want to just speak to the world anymore. They want to speak out there too. To the stars? Alara asked, squinting into the light. To the ones who watched? Kane said, tone unreadable. Maybe even two. The ones who left us this tech in the first place. And you want me to write the speech? Alara asked, a trace of bitter humor in her voice. Kane shook her head. I want you to decide whether we say anything at all. Alara stopped walking. Kane did too for a moment. The wind moved through them, empty and dry and utterly free of consequence. A rare thing these days. Why me? Alara asked quietly. You know the answer, Kane replied. You're the one who made them see us. The Zentari didn't understand us until you gave them a reflection of who we really are. If we speak again, it can't be from power. It has to be from perspective. Alara looked down at the case, then slowly reached out and opened it. Inside was the new transmitter built from the reverse-engineered scaffolding of the original artifact. But shaped by human hands, it pulsed faintly, not waiting for a signal, but for a choice. Later that night, in the mountains outside the base, Alara sat alone with the transmitter, gazing up at a sky full of stories, and she spoke not with a message, but with memory. She loaded recordings, snippets of humanity, a child's laugh, a scientist arguing with her mentor, the sound of rain on broken pavement, the first chords of an old jazz song played on vinyl, a deep breath taken before a protest, a silence shared after loss, a whisper in the dark saying, you're not alone. Not to impress, not to boast, just to say, we are here, and if someone is listening again, if someone is still watching from behind veils of nebula and time and fear, they will hear this not as a threat or as a cry for attention, but as an invitation, not just to speak, but to be understood. In that signal, drifting out on the thinnest pulse of light and hope, Alara did something no civilization had ever done before. She welcomed the unknown, not with fear, but with grace, and far above, in dark places older than starlight, something stirred not. To retaliate but to respond. Space doesn't echo. It doesn't vibrate with history like ancient stone, or whisper secrets like wind across ruined monuments. Space simply holds things, holds them until someone stumbles across them, wakes them, or forgets them entirely, and someone had just woken. Something older than the Zentari, something the Zentari had tried very, very hard to forget. The transmission Alara sent, the one laced not with commands or warnings, but with unfiltered slices of human life, didn't just reach the stars, reached the dark between them, and in that dark, something watched it. Something that had been buried not in time, but in memory. Something the Zentari once feared so deeply they rewrote star charts just to avoid the places it had passed. They called it, in their oldest language, Valsathkor, which roughly translated to the echo that judges, a remnant of a species that had once wielded stories like blades, logic like fire, and culture like contagion. It hadn't died. It had been waiting for another voice like its own asterisk, when heard. Earth signal, a patchwork melody of grief and hope, loss and defiance, chaos and brilliance. It didn't see a planet of primitives fumbling with an old toy. It saw a successor at Site Sigma. Alara didn't sleep much. She stared at walls now. Not out of trauma, but from the weight of knowing too much. The artifact no longer pulsed, yet her dreams burned with strange geometry. She saw cities not yet built, languages she couldn't speak but somehow understood, and voices, thousands of them, asking her one unanswerable question. Are you ready? Colonel Kane entered her room that morning without knocking. 2 more. Anomalies last night, she said quietly, sitting on the edge of Alara's desk. 1 near Jupiter's orbit. Another closer? Alara asked, voice rasped with sleeplessness. Low lunar orbit, Kane replied. Passing her a datapad, the reading showed a single object silent. Inert, small moving with impossible precision just above them. Moon's equator asterisk, no emissions, no propulsion, but somehow it was there. Is it Centauri? Alara asked. Kane shook her head. No known signature. It's not one of theirs. Not one of ours either. But get this, when we analyzed its orbit trace, we found something wild. She flipped the display. The orbit wasn't new, it was thousands of years old, a perfect pattern. Just waiting for a signal to align. Alara felt it then, a weight drop in her chest. They didn't leave the artifact for us, she said, voice barely a whisper. They left it for whoever could speak the way they did, whoever could listen to meaning rather than noise. It was never a message. It was a test. Kane's expression tightened. Well, we passed. And now something else wants to talk. The object above the moon began to transmit no words, no threats, just a pattern, 3 pulses, then 5, then 13, then 89 Fibonacci. Silence, then a single pulse, a pause, then a data burst unlike anything ever seen. Not just symbols, not just logic, but memories, not Earth's, not Antaresamine Elsie's visions of planets with twin suns, cities made of sound and stone. Creatures of light debating with gravity-bound beings. Moments of extinction, moments of ascension, and then darkness, a cultural collapse, and the single decision to encode it all into a memory system, woven into physical relic seeds scattered through the stars, meant not to warn, but to seed understanding. And Earth had watered only. Lara, breathless, stared at the unfolding cascade of meaning in front of her. It was not an attack. It was a handshake. A connection. Who are they? She asked aloud, knowing no one had the answer yet, but Kane replied anyway. Maybe they're the ones who came before the Centauri. The ones they tried to erase. The ones who built the artifact. And maybe, she hesitated, maybe they're not all gone. Alara didn't look away from the display. They're not. Because part of them is already here now. In us, and somewhere far beyond. A dozen civilizations that had turned their backs on the stars began to receive something unexpected, a signal, a voice, a story, not from a god, not from an empire, but from humanity, a young species on a fragile world. Not yet unified, not yet peaceful, but alive in ways the ancients had forgotten to be, and some of those civilizations began to listen for the first time in millennia. The stars began to remember again. They didn't come with fanfare. They didn't arrive in glowing ships or blinding light. There was no fleet this time, no war protocol, no admiral orbiting Earth waiting to decide if humanity deserved to breathe. Another day, they simply answered it, began with a low hum in the deep sky arrays of the square-kilometer array facility in South Africa, an anomalous signal that wasn't reflected off stars or bent by black holes. It was too precise, too clean. A deliberate return on a frequency only one planet had used Earth within 6 minutes. 14 other observatories across the globe reported identical patterns, a Response structured, layered, complex, the signal encoded. No demands, no coordinates, no countdowns, just invitations, and those invitations weren't in any known language, yet could be parsed with ease by every major AI on the planet. They matched not grammar, but emotion, structure, memory inside Psych Sigma. Alara sat once more before the artifact, surrounded by the top linguists, data engineers, and defense officials the world had to offer, all trying to decipher the reply. But the reply wasn't for them. It was for her. The artifact pulsed again for the first time in days. Soft blue lines spiraling outward like ripples in air, and Alara closed her eyes, not to understand, but to feel, and she did. The response was simple. In meaning, even if vast in content, you heard us. We see you. Let us begin. The room around her erupted in chaos, officials speaking into headsets, analysts typing, commanders shouting. But Alara remained still because she knew this wasn't a diplomatic event. It wasn't a summit. It wasn't first contact. Anymore, it was something more sacred. Recognition. Earth was no longer alone in the cosmos, not because they found life, but because they had been acknowledged. That Centauri, once poised to destroy them, had left orbit entirely. Their silent watch had ended. Reports said they'd returned to their own territory, and for the first time in their recorded history, were holding internal forums on cultural restraint. Other signals began appearing, minor bursts from sectors once silent for millennia. A distant colony, lost to time, pinged back with ancient echoes. Old machines in orbit around dead worlds blinked to life. Languages that had not been spoken in a billion years were now humming through long dormant relays, all triggered by one thing: a human voice that dared to speak without fear. 6 months later, a new department was born, not of war, not of intelligence, but of continuity. The United Nations formed the Institute of Interstellar Memory, located in a multinational arcology on the edge of the Atacama Desert. Its mission: to catalog Earth's cultural essence, not just to preserve, but to share. Alara Vance was appointed its first director, not because she was the highest ranking, not because she had the clearest clearance, but because she had listened first, and in her opening address, streamed across Earth and silently into the void through low-frequency neutrino bursts. She didn't give a speech of power. She gave a story. She told of a young scientist, a relic buried beneath dust, a signal born by accident, and a response that changed everything, not with fire, but with memory. She ended with a sentence that would be translated across 1,000 platforms and whispered to the dark edges of space: we are not the first. We may not be the greatest, but we are here, we are listening, and we are ready to learn. Somewhere far beyond the Orion Arm, a council of beings made not of matter, but of patterned time listened quietly. Some had once burned worlds. Some had once walked among stars and then sealed themselves into silence. Others had simply forgotten how to feel awe, but now they remembered, because Earth had reminded them, not through dominance, not through perfection, but through something else entirely: humanity. Mistake that spoke like a miracle. The species that answered a war beacon with a whisper of art. The ones who turned memory into a message. So the universe, long silent, began to speak again, not all at once, not in peace, not in certainty, but in conversation. And in that first conversation, Earth was not a target. It was a participant, and in that small, impossible miracle, humanity had won.
Thank you for listening, Alien Chronicles. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe our channel for more Galactic Saga. And please visit our channel to get new stories every day.